Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I call this episode 12 Amazing Humanoid Encounters. And yeah, I think they are amazing. I find the humanoid cases endlessly fascinating. There's so many of them. They're coming from all over the world. It's been happening for a very long time. The variation of the humanoids is mind-blowing. There's so much I think we can learn from these cases about the ETs, about their agenda on our planet, and actually about ourselves as well. So I've chosen 12 cases which come from all over the world. And by that I mean Denmark, France, Argentina, Brazil, Italy, Sweden, Portugal, Germany, Japan actually, from Canada, and from the United States. I've also chosen cases that span quite a long period of time, all the way back to the 1940s up to the 2000s, covering each decade in between. I think this is important because it shows that this is an ongoing phenomenon, one that has been occurring for a very long time. A lot of these cases are quite brief. Some do rest solely on one person's anecdotal testimony, but some are multiple witness cases with some really compelling physical evidence as well, and professionally researched. I think all of these cases are important. Every case does have something to teach us about what's going on here, and these cases I think you'll find super interesting. I've always said that the best evidence we have for the veracity of this phenomenon is the fact that there are so many cases. So let's just get started because there are quite a few cases I'd like to cover today. And the first case I call Soldiers or Aliens. This is a single witness case, so it's largely resting on one person's anecdotal testimony, though apparently there were some landing traces, but it wasn't professionally investigated. This case took place back in July or August of 1940 in Kongens Tisted, Central Jutland, Denmark. And it's an important case because this witness really had no idea about UFOs and actually didn't think he was seeing ETs until much later. This case comes from the Danish magazine UFO Neat, and the case involves a 15-year-old boy by the name of Solskin. It was a summer afternoon, again in 1940, and the witness was doing chores to collect water for cattle. And as he walked along a dirt road heading towards a place called Tisberg Hill, he saw three unusual-looking men walking towards him. They were unusual because all three were dressed in dark green, shiny, silk-like skin tight suits. It covered most of their bodies, including the neck and part of the chin, and also went right down to their feet, including their boots. They also wore tight-fitting helmets of the same color that seemed attached to their jumpsuits. They had transparent faceplates that looked very much like glass, and the witness also noticed these sort of rope-like or bead-like attachments which went down the front of their jumpsuits from the shoulder all the way down to the foot. Otherwise, these suits had no markings on them, no buttons, zippers, pockets, or anything. They were of normal proportion for an average person, and he honestly thought at first that they were military personnel or mechanics. But he was very surprised to see them there, as this area was pretty desolate and isolated. Now, they seemed to be heading directly towards him, but suddenly, when they were about 90 feet away from him, they turned to the south and started to walk behind a hill. He wondered if they had actually turned to avoid them, and by this time he was so frightened that he said his heart was pretty much up in his throat. But, ever curious to see who they were and where they were going and what they were doing, he rushed up to the top of this little hill, and he could now see them from the back. He saw that their suits were actually very smooth on the backside, but as he looked to where they were walking, he got another incredible shock. Because sitting on the ground right near them was a shiny metallic, round, dome-shaped object. It had no windows or doors or any visible landing gear. It was just sitting there directly on the ground. and it wasn't huge. He says about as big as a small fighter plane. At that time, World War II had begun, and the Germans were actually occupying the country. So Susskind wondered if these figures were German soldiers and the craft was some sort of secret military craft. But it certainly didn't look like the ones he had already seen, neither the craft nor the soldiers. And as he watched, these figures walked right up to the craft, stood next to it for just a few moments, and then suddenly disappeared inside it. This was very puzzling to the witness because he didn't see any doors open or close. Then, seconds later, the craft rose vertically and silently upwards, very slowly at first. Then after about 7 seconds, it turned slightly, and its speed increased dramatically, and it darted upward at an oblique angle, disappearing into the sky in a matter of seconds. And during this time, he heard a, quote, violent whoosh noise, which kind of reminded him of when someone snaps a fishing line. So he was very much impressed by all of this. He ran down to where this craft had landed and did see that the heather, the bushes, where this craft had landed, had been crushed down, but were already now straightening back up. So he wondered if they really were German soldiers that he saw, because he had seen soldiers before, and their aircraft, but this was completely different. He was particularly impressed that this craft made almost no noise at all. So he went home, told his mother, and she told him that it must have been Germans and that he was not allowed to ever speak of it. And it was many years later, as an adult, that he heard about UFOs and ETs, and finally in 1974 reported his experience to researchers. Can you imagine not talking about your encounter for 34 years, keeping it secret? Partly because you were afraid to tell people, partly because you didn't understand what you saw. I'm so glad this witness did stumble upon the UFO subject and contact an investigator because he was able to get his experience documented. And that's important because I've said it before, the vast majority of cases go completely unreported and undocumented. So any estimates as to how common this is probably way too low. That's what makes each case important. Each case adds to our knowledge of what's going on here. Now, the next case I'd like to cover is also super fascinating. I love this case because it does involve 3 witnesses who saw a UFO and humanoids very close up. If it were just one witness, that's fine, but 2 or 3 absolutely adds to the credibility of a case. So I call this one the Old Thin Alien. And it took place in the summer of 1951 in Beausoleil. This is in the Alpes Maritime in France. And I think you'll agree it's a fascinating case. This next case was published in the French magazine Lumière dans la Nuit, Lights in the Night, and it involves 3 witnesses, all of who have requested anonymity. 2 are a married couple, Mr. and Mrs. X, age 49 and 40, and their friend Mr. Y, who is actually a police officer. And it was one afternoon in the summer of 1951 that they had gone to see a play located at 21 Rue de Martyr. And as they got onto the street, all 3 witnesses were distracted by an object in the sky. And looking up, they saw a small oval object only about 180 feet away. And it was quite low, about 25 feet up in the sky, directly above the theater itself where they were walking to. This object appeared to be completely transparent and not very large, about 12 to 15 feet wide. The craft itself was tilted as if to allow the pilot, who was inside this craft, a better view of what was going on below him. So all 3 witnesses were amazed. They moved closer and were even more shocked to see that there was a pilot, a strange-looking man sitting in a chair inside this craft. They were viewing him in profile. He sat in this seat in the front of the vehicle. This man appeared to be of normal height, but he was dressed in light-colored clothes, and while he looked human, he appeared to be, quote, thin and old. He had very fair skin, but most odd to the witnesses was that he had a long white beard. Now this pilot, this UFO occupant, didn't appear to notice the witnesses and instead seemed to be absorbed in contemplating and observing the play that was going on beneath him. Now nobody else in the theater audience seemed to notice this object, though they did all have their backs to this UFO and were paying close attention to the play. Now the witnesses did notice that the man seemed to be actually leaning forward in his seat to more closely observe the goings-on below him. And as the three witnesses observed more closely and got closer, they were amazed to see a second pilot seated alongside the first, though because they were looking at him in profile, this second pilot was pretty much behind the first, so they couldn't see him as clearly. Another odd thing that the witnesses noticed was that they couldn't see any type of machinery or controls or anything in the craft. It was just the chair and these two guys. And as they got within shouting distance of the audience at the theater, they began to shout out to them in order to alert them of this strange object hovering just behind them and over their heads. But as they did so, this object immediately and suddenly moved off quickly towards the northeast, making a soft whistling noise and moving behind the roof of a house and out of view. So by the time anyone else looked, this object was already gone, and the three witnesses were unable to convince anyone about what they had seen at the theater. So this was a quick observation, lasting about a half minute. None of the witnesses felt any fear, nor did they experience anything unusual, except the wife, Mrs. X, said that she did hear what she thought were strange voices, quote, like Russian, though she can't be sure if this was directly connected to her sighting or just a coincidence, but she thought it was odd enough to be worth mentioning to the UFO researchers that they contacted following this encounter. What an unusual case that is. I'm glad there were three witnesses. It's a shame that the other people who were there didn't believe them, but they had each other. They all agree on what they saw. This old, thin-looking alien with a beard, which was apparently watching this play, just as they had gone to do. It's an interesting aspect of UFO behavior. These craft do sometimes seem to come down and just check out what people are doing. And that looks like what was going on in this case. I think it's an important one, which is why I included it in this little collection. And now we move to the next case, because there's always another one. And I call this next one, The Artists and the Aliens. This case did get quite a bit of attention when it occurred, but it's virtually unknown today. It occurred on December 28, 1954, near Mendoza, Argentina. This was along a lonely, remote highway late at night. But it's an important case because it does involve 7 witnesses, all adults, all of who agree upon what they saw. It involves a landed UFO and humanoids, and it's got some really interesting aspects to it. This next case comes from researcher Roberto Banks and was widely published in a number of magazines and in at least one book. It was around 3:30 a.m., again on December 28, 1954, as a group of 7 people, including a concert performer, a conductor by the name of Mr. Gaeta, and 5 artists, were all traveling by car along Route 143 to Mendoza, Argentina. Now suddenly, ahead of them alongside the road, they noticed a brilliant light. And as they approached, they were amazed to see that this light was actually a landed flying saucer about 500 feet off the side of the road. It was a brilliant blue light, but not blinding. They were able to see it pretty clearly. So amazed, they stopped the car and exited to get a better look. In fact, they walked right up to it through a little vineyard, stopping less than 150 feet away from this craft. And they could now see this craft clearly. They said it had the shape of 2 soup bowls placed end to end. The blue light they saw was coming from the edges, as was this weird foggy mist. They noticed no visible windows or doors, but they did immediately notice that standing next to this craft were 2 strange figures. One was standing straight up, while the other was crouching down doing something to the ground. They noticed that both of these figures were dressed in a one-piece, dark-colored bodysuit with a hood and a transparent face mask, though they couldn't really see their faces. As they watched, a sort of sliding door opened in the side of the craft, and these two figures entered in a weird way, kind of lifting their feet as if walking on stairs or something, though they didn't notice any stairs. So these figures entered into the craft, the door closed. Almost immediately this object rose up from the ground, while the lights on the craft itself began to blink on and off. This really frightened the witnesses, and they rushed back to the road and watched as this craft began to do a series of sort of choppy, zigzag motions, stopping, hovering, moving at right angles. So now back in the car, they took off down the road and were surprised to see that this craft was actually beginning to pace their vehicle. It would follow first on one side and then immediately blink over to the other side, and sometimes actually above the car. But it moved so quickly that they didn't actually see it moving. It was almost instantaneous. It would be on one side and then instantly on the other. And this happened several times, and it followed them for a good 20 minutes until morning arrived. All of the witnesses agreed on these details, and all agreed that they had encountered what they believe are ETs and a craft from beyond Earth. That must have been quite an experience, driving along, seeing this bright light ahead of you, stopping the car, getting out, and realizing you're looking at a landed flying saucer with humanoids right next to it. They got a pretty good view walking right up to it. It's a shame that they were so frightened, because there might have been communication, but I also find it fascinating that they got back into their car and drove off, and what happens? This UFO follows them for 20 minutes. So this implies that the ETs were absolutely aware they were being observed. So I don't know exactly why the UFO followed them. We can only speculate, but clearly it had no fear of being seen, and there was some interesting interaction there. And that alone, I think, makes this case super interesting. And now we move to another case. This one's also really interesting. I like this one because it's a long-lasting encounter. It involves physiological reactions. The whole family saw it, and it really affected them extremely profoundly. I call this one a church-going alien, and it occurred on June 26, 1962, in a very crowded area of Verona, Italy. It's an amazing case. It was a very warm night on June 26, 1962, as the Paragazza family was in their home located at 5 Via Abramo Massalongo in Verona, Italy. Now, the family consisted of the mother, Maria Paragazza, and her two children, Luisa and Roberto, aged 25 and 20 respectively. And they were all sitting in their living room, kind of smoking cigarettes, sitting by the open window, which looked over the Santa Anastasia Church right across the street. You can see it here. Then, suddenly, without warning, an enormous silvery disk appeared in the sky, zigzagging back and forth and downwards until it stopped right over the church. Roberto saw it first and shouted out, "Look, a flying saucer!" And all three watched in amazement as this thing came down and then hovered right over the church and remained there for a long time, almost an hour. Finally, they actually grew tired of watching it. So they decided finally they were just going to go to bed. Roberto went to his own room. He had a separate room. Maria slept in a bed on the far side of the living room, but Luisa slept on a divan which was right next to the window overlooking the church. So, it was around 3 a.m. that Luisa was suddenly awakened by a sense of icy cold. It actually woke her up, making her teeth chatter, and then, looking out the window, she was confronted by an incredible sight. And I'll just let Luisa describe it in her own words. And she says, "The temperature seemed to have dropped below zero. Such cold. And then I saw a green, fluctuating light invade the whole room. Before I could recover from my astonishment, I saw appear, 2 paces from my bed, and in the rectangular opening of the window, an incorporeal being in human form, but with only the outlines hazily defined. The rest of it was transparent. It had an enormous, close-shaven head. Although impalpable and maybe weightless, I could nevertheless see it, gigantic, with its huge legs and its huge hands extended towards me as if it intended to carry me off. It was motionless, and only its hands brushed me. It had no particular odor. So this being's hands actually touched Louisa's face, and this is when, naturally, she screamed in terror, waking up both her mother and her brother. Her mother immediately looked to the window and saw this being, and in fact it shocked her so badly she fell out of bed in a dead faint. Roberto rushed from his room and came out in time to also see this entity glowing with green light. And as they watched, this being began to recede. It decreased in size, finally becoming this tiny little green dot, and then suddenly it winked out, they said, just like a TV set being turned off. However, they did notice that the freezing cold persisted in the room for some moments after this encounter. Now, this was very traumatic for them. In fact, the trauma from it persisted for months afterward. And finally, after 3 months, the family decided they couldn't take it anymore, and they actually moved from their home and into a cottage into the country. That case did get a lot of publicity. I really feel for the witnesses because it did affect them quite profoundly, to the point where they actually ended up leaving their home and finding another residence. Just goes to show an encounter can affect you on so many different levels. And that's clearly true in that case. Quite traumatic for the whole family. And now we move to the next case, which is super interesting. I call this one An Appointment with Humanoids. This involves an apparent CE5, a human-initiated encounter. And it's so interesting because the beings that these people saw might not have been ETs at all, but something else entirely. I think a lot of stuff gets put under the UFO umbrella that might not necessarily belong there or be categorized as extraterrestrials, meaning biological beings from another planet. But you can make up your own mind about this case. It's a multiple witness case, certainly very fascinating. It occurred on October 29, 1965, near Vagaro, Sweden. And I think you'll agree, this is an important case. This unusual humanoid encounter was originally researched by Sven Olaf Svensson, and it involves a fairly well-known couple by the name of Sture and Turid Johnson. Turid works as a trance medium and has actually entertained famous people in his home in Sweden, such as Shirley MacLaine and Dennis Weaver. But before achieving fame, this couple did have a very unusual experience. It was again on October 29, 1965, when the wife, Turid, received a psychic message that she and her husband should travel to Vagaro. This is an area south of Stockholm, Sweden. And this voice told her to be there at 10 o'clock. Now this impressed her because this was not the first time she had received this message. The voice also told her to, quote, "Be careful, there is a power struggle on Earth," but did not elaborate on what that meant. So I'll just let Stuart describe in her own words what happened. As she says, "When we arrived at the place we were told to visit, those entities were already there, but we did not observe them until we had parked the car. It was not totally dark, but twilight. We noticed them first over the field, and then they came very close to the car, about 50 centimeters. We believe there were 5 or 6, between 1.25 to 1.5 meters, which is 3.5 feet tall. And as Stuart says, they had large heads and shining eyes. The eyes were red, phosphorus. The entities didn't walk, but floated around in straight lines. I wished for all my life that another car would come, but no one showed up. After some time, the entities disappeared over the field, and then it was like a saucer tried to land on the car. Our whole car shook, and the radio screamed in the back seat. We took cover below the dashboard. So clearly they were both quite frightened. They estimated that all of this lasted about 5 minutes. But as Stewart says, it felt like an eternity. They weren't able to get a very good look at the entities because they were so frightened, but they could see that they were humanoid in form, meaning, a head, arms, and legs. But after these beings left and the car stopped shaking, the couple sat in the car for a good while before finally going home. When they finally did reach home, they were amazed to see that it was already early morning. They both felt like they had experienced some missing time, but neither had any desire to undergo hypnotic regression to discover what happened during this missing time. Now, researcher Hakan Blomqvist interviewed them in person, and they discussed the possibility that these were spiritual entities of some kind, perhaps elementals, Hakan speculated. And in fact, under trance, Stewart did explore this possibility and seemed to confirm this theory, saying that, quote, they are created by humans themselves. So these might not be ETs as we would think of it, or something else entirely. A really interesting case for sure, given that there are 2 witnesses. This was a pretty long-lasting encounter, and they had apparent missing time, which I have a lot of questions about, because if they had missing time and this was more of a spiritual entity that they saw, that raises all kinds of implications. It's an important case, I think, in that regard alone. Now let's move to the next case, which I think is a really important case, because although this is a single witness case, it does involve some really profound and undeniable physical evidence in the terms of landing traces. And the witness does, by all accounts, seem to be absolutely sincere. I call this one the ETs by the Hospital, and it took place on September 14, 1967, outside of Belo Horizonte, Brazil. It's a really interesting and unusual case. This case comes from Brazilian researcher Professor Holvio B. Aleixo. The witness is a 16-year-old young man by the name of Fabio J. Diniz. It was around 10:30 a.m., again on September 14, 1967, as Fabio was walking by the Baleia Hospital in Belo Horizonte, hoping to sell some metal window shutters. Now suddenly, his attention was drawn to a strange object shaped somewhat like a mushroom, which was sitting in the middle of the field. Now this was military recruiting week in the area, so Fabio immediately assumed that the object was associated with the military. But he was curious, so he walked up to it and became even more puzzled by what he saw, because it did not look military. This object was basically dome-shaped. It had little round portholes all around the circumference and rested on a central pillar, which gave it sort of mushroom appearance. Now he estimates that this was a pretty large craft, 60 feet wide, brown in color, and the craft itself was emitting flashes of red, yellow, and blue lights from the bottom part of the dome. The central pillar was shiny black, about 9 feet wide and 6 feet high, so pretty big. Suddenly, Fabio heard this strange creaking sound, and what looked like a weird glass-like screen sort of came down around the bottom central section of this dome. And as he watched, immediately a dark door-like opening appeared at the base of the central pillar, and out stepped 2 humanoid figures. This startled Fabio, and he stepped back, and immediately he heard a voice saying, "Don't run away, come back." So Fabio now found himself pretty much face to face with these 2 unusual beings. He was about 15 feet away from them, and one began to walk around the pillar as if inspecting it, while the other faced him and said in perfect Portuguese, "Appear here tomorrow, or we will take your family." So these figures appeared to be 6, maybe 7 feet tall, with strong bodies. According to Fabio, they were dressed from head to toe in a tight-fitting jumpsuit, very much like divers wear. They wore a helmet the dark section over the mouth and nose, so he couldn't see that part of their face. The only skin visible was on their face, and he said they seemed to have sort of a greenish tint to their skin, two very large, round, widely set eyes with no visible whites to them, all just black. They had these thick, kind of triangular shaped eyebrows. Again, could not see any mouth or nose. He did notice that one of them had an antenna-like protrusion on his helmet, but the other did not. He also noticed that they had very heavy footwear, which flattened the grass wherever they stepped. So by this time, the figure that was walking around the pillar had rejoined the first one, and he was carrying a device in his hand which Fabio interpreted to be a weapon of some kind. The two figures then turned back towards the door in the central pillar and entered into it. The door closed, the glass-like screen that was surrounding the whole perimeter of the craft went back up inside it, making its same strange sound. The door closed, and the object began to slowly and silently rise straight up. At this point, Fabio ran away in fear. He did turn around once, just in time to see this object flying off at an angle, but still moving quite slowly. So he kept running and turned back one more time, and by this time the object was no longer visible. So he ran to the bus stop, intending to go straight home and tell his mother, but instead decided to go directly to the police. The police immediately alerted UFO investigators, and in less than 2 hours after the encounter, they arrived, interviewed the witness firsthand, and went to the scene of the incident. And as researcher Holvio says, and I quote, "Searching around for some evidence or other on the dried ground and the bone-dry grass, we perceived two small depressions in the form of an arc of a circle lying a considerable distance from one another. Near one of them was a slight depression shaped like the heel of a rather large shoe, which Fabio reckoned was a footprint of one of the individuals. Now, they also did find a small quantity of scorched granular material which had an unpleasant odor. And this was submitted to an analysis which proved to be quite interesting because this granular material turned out to be comprised of iron, aluminum, magnesium, and silica. So not sure what that means, but it's certainly not naturally occurring in that area. Fabio did return to the site the next day as instructed by the alleged ETs. Unfortunately, the craft did not show up. What a bizarre case that is. I can only imagine seeing a landed UFO and humanoids that close up in an area that, is fairly well populated. Such a shame more people didn't see this. Though I have to say, that's not unusual. And UFOs and ETs seem to be able to control who sees them and who doesn't. And it's very possible other people did see it, but simply didn't report it. Glad there were landing traces because that helps to authenticate the encounter. Such a shame the UFOs didn't show up the next day like they said they would, but even that's not super unusual. All right, now we move to the next case. This is another multiple witness case. Doesn't involve any real physical evidence, but certainly fascinating because it was a series of events which culminated in a really unusual humanoid encounter. I call this one the recumbent aliens. It took place in September of 1973 near Alentejo, Portugal. And this was another lonely highway at night encounter with a UFO and humanoids that were quite close to the car, and really unusually described humanoids as well. That alone makes this case super interesting. This next astonishing case involves 3 witnesses on a road trip near, again, Alentejo, Portugal. The witnesses include Serge Ribeiro Lisboa, age 38, his wife, Maria Filomero Costa Lisboa, she's also 38, and their friend Marmela Santos Costa, who was 28 years old. It was a clear night. They had just exited the city of Tua when they heard this weird, strange buzzing noise coming from outside their car. And at the same time, they saw this faint glow off to the right. So they decided to pull over to figure out what was going on. And they could now see that this light was actually a solid object, a white, glowing, disc-shaped object. It appeared to have a transparent dome on top, which was illuminated with a red light. It looked to be metallic. They estimate it was about 6 feet in diameter and maybe 1,000 feet high. They wondered if it had been drawn to their car by the headlights, because this was a pretty remote country road. Now, a bit nervous by the closeness of this object, they got back into the car and continued driving. And they had just reached the town of Alijo when Serge noticed that the car seemed to be slowing down by itself. They were exiting the town, and at the same time they heard and felt this weird buzzing noise again. And this is when this disc-shaped craft reappeared. It seemed to be making a rhythmic, modulated buzzing. The craft quickly disappeared, but a few miles down the road, they saw this strange object ahead of them on the road. It was kind of hard for Serge to describe, but he says it looked sort of like a cylindrical object, bright green, moving along at about 20 miles per hour ahead of them. So Serge put on the brakes, and while this was happening, Filomena and Marmela noticed something else. They saw two red flashes right alongside the left side of the road. And as they drove up to these red flashing lights, they saw that these were actually two short humanoids, about 5 feet tall, lying recumbent on their backs on the road embankment. Both these humanoids wore a shiny silver, kind of loose-fitting jumpsuit, gloves, and a spherical helmet with a rectangular faceplate, and a 20-inch long antenna on the top of their helmets. And the red flashes were actually coming from the tips of these antennae. So they were driving at very low speed at this point and came right up alongside these two humanoids, which were by now only 6 feet away from their car. And all three witnesses saw them, and they were close enough that all three heard this very weird, low, gurgling sound. So they were pretty frightened. Serge pressed on the accelerator. The car seemed very sluggish. He pressed on the accelerator, except it had a delayed effect. The car just wasn't moving in the speed it should be. But as it moved forward, they were about to reach this strange cylindrical object ahead of them. And this is when something very odd happened. The two humanoids rose from the ground in a weird, rigid, vertical manner, without bending their arms or legs. They just kind of almost levitated upwards. At this point, the flashing red lights on their antenna went out. The witnesses could now see that the two humanoids were wearing strange backpacks, which were attached to their jumpsuits. And to the witnesses' amazement, these two figures rose up into the air and literally disappeared right over their car. They continued driving, and as they reached the next town, they considered stopping to inform the police about their experience, but decided against it as they knew that their story would be hard to explain. What a crazy case that is. Short little ETs all dressed up in their sort of aluminum foil suits with their helmets, a little antenna on top. Really interesting. Pretty much your classic humanoid encounter. Another very interesting aspect is how that encounter ended, with the humanoids rising up in that weird way they did and basically just flying over the car and disappearing to who knows where. Certainly it was an encounter that really impressed all three witnesses. Now we move on to the next one. This is an important case which unfortunately wasn't professionally investigated, but it's absolutely interesting because it is a first-hand account. This is not hearsay. This comes directly from the witness. I call this one Landing and Humanoids in Bozeman. A lot of these encounters occur while people are driving along a highway, and that's what happened here. This one took place in summer of 1978 in Bozeman, Montana. And I like this case because the witness describes what happened in his own words in pretty good detail. So this case comes from an anonymous gentleman known only as Bob, who did report his experience to the UFOsentinel.com website. And it's quite an interesting encounter which occurred in a lonely area of Bozeman, Montana. And I'll just let the witness describe what he experienced in his own words. As he says, I was driving late at night in the summer of 1978, a few miles outside of Bozeman, and I noticed a bright light a bit away from the road. I decided to pull over and check it out, thinking that it could be a fire that needed to be put out. Back in those days, we cared about things, and if we saw potential danger, we would step in to take care of it if we could. In this spirit of communal good, I stopped the car and walked towards the light. It was a UFO, a hat-shaped UFO that was standing on the ground on 3 legs. Around the parked UFO were 3 small humanoid creatures. They were small, like children, and had very long arms and big heads and big black eyes. The UFO had big rectangular panels on it, and really looked like a hat with a very thick, narrow brim. If you look at the picture I've drawn, you get a good idea of what it looked like. I hid behind a rock, not because I was brave and wanted to see more, but because I was afraid they would see me. I curled up behind the rock in fear for my life. After what felt like an eternity, probably about 10 minutes, I heard a hissing sound. I peeked out from behind the rock, and I saw that the hat-shaped UFO was rising up towards the sky. It was completely gone after a few seconds. Witnessing this UFO and these aliens was a defining moment for me. I started researching UFOs in my spare time and have been a UFO enthusiast ever since. UFOs are real, and we are being visited by aliens. I know this because I saw it myself. I've talked to many other people who have seen UFOs, and they fall in different categories. Within the categories, they are similar. The type of vessel matches the type of alien. There's probably a handful of alien civilizations visiting us on a regular basis. So that's Tom's story. He posted his experience on the website in 2016, which was a full 38 years after his encounter. An amazing case, I think you'll agree, and another example of how profoundly an encounter can affect a witness. The fact that it took him 38 years to report this encounter just goes to show that. And again, I have to give kudos to the witness for reporting it because most people don't. I can only imagine how many encounters there must be. Very likely, other people are seeing these things and corroborate other people's encounters, but they're just not reporting it. It's such a shame. I'm glad that this subject is now moving into the mainstream and getting some legitimacy because it certainly deserves it. The only real reason I think people are skeptical is because we're all victims of this UFO cover-up. Our governments, our military, have spent an enormous amount of time, money, and energy, your tax dollars, to make UFO witnesses look like idiots, liars, on drugs, hallucinating. And it's so unfortunate because there really shouldn't be any skepticism at all surrounding this subject. All the fear and disinformation and confusion. It's such a shame because this is a true subject. There's no doubt about that. There are enough cases that we can say for sure something is going on. You can argue till the cows come home about where these guys come from, what their agenda is, and so forth. But the fact is, we do have enough evidence to conclusively prove without a doubt in a court of law that UFOs are real. And now let's move to another case. I like this one because it involves 4 witnesses, very close-up encounter with a UFO and humanoids in a very urban area during daylight hours. I mean, it's an undeniable case. This next encounter took place at 1441 Lawrence Avenue East in Toronto, Ontario, and involves 4 witnesses. Elizabeth Nagy, who's only 11 years old, her mother, and her 2 twin brothers, Zoltan and Tibor. They had just left their apartment building, and it was one of the twin boys who saw it first. Turning around and looking up, he noticed a very large oval-shaped craft with about 15 windows along one side hovering directly over their apartment building. I mean, very low above it. And he shouted out, and all four witnesses turned around, looked upward, and stared in absolute amazement at this clearly unusual craft. And Elizabeth describes it in her own words, as she said, "It had windows which were moving around the ship from right to left. A series of ET shadows were walking inside the ship, about 30 of them, like it was a school ship watching us. There was a red light on the bottom of the ship, and a blue and a yellow light just under two windows. It was silent. Suddenly, it shot up diagonally, disappeared behind a cloud, reappeared, then drew away, becoming smaller and smaller, and was gone. When it moved upward, it looked like a disc. The UFO had sharp edges. It looked solid and was larger than a basketball held at arm's length." So this was a pretty big craft, and they estimate that they watched it for at least 5 minutes, maybe as much as 10, when it finally moved off. The sighting deeply impressed all of them, and in fact it changed the course of Elizabeth's life. She became a huge believer in UFOs. As she says, "I was very excited. It was unbelievable. I told all my schoolmates and teachers." Later, as an adult, she joined the Canadian UFO Research Network and shared her experience with investigators, and her account was published in the journal. It's quite an amazing case. So admittedly, that is a very brief case, a quick event, but it's something that the witness remembered and inspired her enough to actually join a UFO group. And I mean, I can only imagine what a surprise it must be for people to look up, see a UFO, and even more shocking, see someone inside that craft looking down at you. Such an amazing case. And that's what happened in this next case, which is perhaps my favorite in this little collection. I call this one The Little Boy in the UFO. This one occurred on September 1st in 1984 in Takamatsu, Japan. This is a single witness case, but it was professionally investigated shortly after the incident, and there is some peripheral corroboration in terms of the mother of the main witness seeing a UFO 2 days after this initial encounter, so that adds a little bit of credibility and corroboration to it. But it's such an amazing case, it's really a bit different than most, and I think you'll find it super interesting. It was 6 p.m. on the evening of September 1st, 1984, as 6-year-old Nao Nashimoto, as you can see here, and her friends were riding bikes in the front of their apartment building located in Takamatsu, Japan. Nao had just reached the edge of the yard by the fence when she noticed a large, round, glowing object hovering at very low elevation over the rice field right in front of their building. So she stopped biking and stared at this object as it moved down and closer in a strange zigzag fashion. She did not tell her playmates for whatever reason. She was just consumed by looking at this object. And as it came closer, it revealed itself to be a very large saucer with a ring of beautiful colored lights around the circumference. There was brilliant red, blue, yellow, orange, and green lights, which shone down beautifully onto the ground, and as it got close, these lights all went out. The object itself was now glowing orange, and it moved down until it was only a few meters above the rice field, near the kindergarten building of a school in the area, low enough that she could see the plants swaying from the effects of this object. And by this point, she was only about 75 feet away from it, and she could see that this object had 4 portholes. The object, it turns out, had a remarkably similar appearance to that described and purportedly photographed by contactee George Adamski. That's quite a controversial case, but this is what she described. It was a very similar looking craft, and has now stared in fascination at this craft She was amazed to see what she described as a handsome little boy appearing in the second porthole from the left, looking down and smiling widely at her. And in fact, she was close enough to see the white teeth in his mouth. And as Now says, he had long hair pulled back from his face. His hair reached his shoulders. It was golden. It was a round face. It was the same color as I. Now spoke with researchers shortly after this incident happened and said that the eyes on this little boy were round and big, that he had a smaller than normal nose, small ears, and a mouth that was, quote, small and charming. Now she only saw his upper torso through the porthole, but could see that he was wearing a sort of shiny gray shirt with a V-neck. And as this craft started to move away, Now wanting to get closer to this craft, raced on her bicycle across the rice field. And when she reached the end of this field, she could still see this craft, and the boy was looking out. He smiled down again at her through the porthole, and this time raised his hand slowly, palm outward, lowered it, and raised it slowly again. This did allow Now to see that his shirt did have long sleeves. And as she watched, this craft began to rotate, moving towards Mount Yashima, hovering about 900 feet above the ocean. It then flashed its lights twice and disappeared. Now estimates that the whole encounter lasted about 15 minutes. And it was gone. Now she at first kept her encounter a secret, but 2 days later, on September 3rd, her mother, Yumiko, announced that she had seen a glowing red UFO while returning home from shopping. This inspired Now to tell her parents what she had seen. They were astonished, as you might expect, but they believed her, not only because of Yumiko's sighting moments earlier, but because they knew their daughter to be honest and truthful. Now later, apparently as a result of this, Now's father became a student of George Adamski's work and became very interested in his contacts and information. The investigator of the case learned a pretty interesting detail about Now, the witness. It turns out that this little girl was displaying very unusual and strong psychic abilities. She said she could see auras, she was experiencing telepathy, and she also said that she recalled a past life as a famous pacifist in the United States protesting against wars. So this is a theme we see in a lot of UFO accounts. To me, one of the most fascinating things about this case is the fact that the witness describes all these paranormal and psychic experiences, because that seems to be the rule with contactees rather than the exception. It's also interesting in that it does come from Japan. We don't hear a whole lot about cases coming from Japan, but they're definitely there. I've said it many times. I think if you dig deep enough, you'll find that every location on this planet has been visited and has a long, rich history of UFO encounters. Again, it's because most people simply don't report it. And the witness in this case actually didn't report it and probably wouldn't have had her mother herself not seen a UFO. It makes me wonder about that, if that was a coincidence or synchronicity or intentional. Of course, impossible to say, but certainly an interesting case. And now we move to another really interesting case. I like this one because this is a daylight encounter. It occurred in a very urban area. There are 2 witnesses. I call this one the Smiling Aliens. And this occurred in July of 1992 near Los Angeles, California. I find this super amazing because actually there was a huge wave of sightings going on throughout the summer of 1992. I investigated 20, 30, 40 cases in that time period alone. So I'm going to add this one to it. And I think that is what brings a new level of corroboration, certainly, or credibility to this otherwise unsubstantiated case which as far as I know wasn't professionally investigated, but was reported to the website ufoevidence.org. The main witness in this case is a young man by the name of Reuben Taylor, and he and his mother were driving along the Hollywood 101 freeway by Echo Park. So it was the mother who first saw the craft and called Reuben's attention to it. As she kind of dipped her head and covered her face when she saw this, but he immediately looked outside in the direction to the right that she had pointed and saw what he thought at first was the world's biggest Ferris wheel, which was sitting about 100 feet off the ground in a horizontal position. He said it was approximately 300 feet in diameter and beautiful, this golden bronze color with a glare that stretched out at least 50 to 100 feet around it. And as he watched, it began to maneuver around, and he realized this was actually more of a saucer-shaped object. And he felt a, quote, great surge of power and this incredible connection to this object as it began to approach closer. And when it did, he was amazed because he could now see in detail numerous human-looking figures looking down at him smiling from behind this center ring of windows. He also saw what looked to him kind of like writing on the top of the craft, which reminded him of perhaps Hebrew or ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. Now he only saw this for a few moments when suddenly, as quickly as it had appeared, this craft went straight up and disappeared into space. Some really interesting details to that case. The fact that this witness felt this surge of energy, I found that fascinating. The fact that it was so close up, these ETs looking down and smiling at you. Can you imagine? But yeah, it was during this time that I was investigating a wave of sightings just a few miles away involving the entire range of UFO activity, from simple sightings, from cars being chased down the highway, landings, people being pulled on board. I ended up writing a whole book about this called UFOs over Topanga Canyon, and this case seems to be a part of this whole complex of UFO encounters that were going on in that area at that time. An amazing case. And now we move to the last one of this dozen cases. And this one is a super interesting case, which I call the Alien Tour Bus. This occurred in November of 2009, fairly recently, in Schwindegg, Germany. Also, what's interesting about this case is this witness saw this UFO very close up, of course saw humanoids through the window, and it affected him emotionally quite profoundly. It is a brief case, but super interesting. This case comes from Hillebrand van Ludwiger and appeared in the German publication Mysterious Lights and Objects in the Sky. The witness is an anonymous gentleman, and he was in his home in Schwindegg, Germany, one evening in November of 2009. It was around 11 p.m. and he looked out his window and he saw this weird object hovering about 150 feet high and 300 feet away. And it was big. He says it was about the size and shape of a large bus and was remaining stationary in the sky. He could see trails of white steam kind of running downward from this object, as if the air had liquefied from the extreme temperature of this object. This object, he said, had 3 large squarish portholes running along the side, which was visible to the witness. More shocking, however, was that he could see figures staring back at him from these portholes. Now, as he watched, this object became briefly invisible and after a few seconds reappeared. And this happened again, disappearing and reappearing, and then again. This repeated a total of about 8 to 10 times, this object blinking in and out from view. Then, suddenly, this object flew very quickly away. It was at this point that he realized he was seeing something incredibly unusual, and he says he became hysterical with confusion and fear. And he actually screamed out loud, badly scaring his own children who were in the apartment. The whole experience was quite short, lasting no more than 3 minutes, but was certainly long enough to convince the witness that he had seen a genuine UFO and its occupants staring down back at him. Some very interesting details in that case. It does make me wonder if these were just ETs coming down, to visit Earth as a tourist attraction. Hard to say for sure. I mean, we don't know. They could have been coming down and picking up someone on board and doing whatever it is they do, but we have no evidence of that. This just appears to be a close encounter with a UFO involving humanoids. There are some interesting details with the mist coming off of this craft. That is something we see quite a bit, which I think speaks towards the extreme temperatures that are probably surrounding these craft. I also found it interesting how the craft kept blinking out and coming back. We do see that quite a bit, which speaks to, I think, how these craft might operate, how they travel interstellar distances, or their interdimensionality, so to speak. But yeah, each case adds to our knowledge of what's going on here, and I think it's important that we take these cases seriously, because there are so many of them. All right, well, that's it for today. I really want to thank you for watching. This is, a really important subject. I don't think people realize just how many cases there are. It's not, in the thousands or even tens of thousands. We're approaching, honestly, if you were to look at all the databases all over the world, close to 1 million documented, reported cases. And when you consider that maybe 1 in 100 people report their encounter in any way, well, you can see how common this might actually be, which just goes to show why there are so many humanoid reports. It's undeniable. Again, you can argue all you want about what these things are or where they come from or why they're here, but the fact is, this is happening. And that alone is monumental. And I think it's time we pay attention to this subject. At some point, this cover-up has got to end. The truth will come out, because I've said this before, truth can be hidden, can be altered, you can cover it up or lie about it, but you can never destroy it. Truth takes care of itself. Truth is truth, and sooner or later, it's gonna come out. And I hope it's sooner. I really do. But we will see. I don't think our governments are going to do it. It's really up to us. So that's it for today. I really want to thank you for watching. I truly appreciate it. It's because of you I do this research. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And until next time, keep watching those skies. There's stuff up there. Keep searching for the truth, and we'll find it. Keep asking those hard questions. And most important of all, keep having fun. And I will see you next week.